Hi, this is Dustin Hausner. I'm the Jewish Outreach and Program Director at the Wayne YMCA. All our Jewish program is funded through the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. So I'm very excited for today's special guest. We've been doing quite a few episodes on authors, and it's always great to find an author who's actually lives in Jersey and is writing about Judaism and different explorations into it. So this is an author of 3 excellent books and is working on a 4th right now. I'd like to introduce our author, Sheldon Haas. Sheldon, it's wonderful to have you here today.
My pleasure.
Excellent. So before we get into your books, I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself for anyone who's maybe unfamiliar with your work.
Okay. I started my Hebrew education at Yeshiva Rabbi Israel Salanter in the Bronx. We were in a little private house originally. Then we moved to an ex-Bell Telephone facility on Webster Avenue. And that's when I really started learning my Hebrew and a little bit of Talmud. I also was lucky at that point because somebody named Joel Feig came into the yeshiva one day and said, I want some boys to join my choir. So I was selected, thank God, because of the experiences I had. It turned out that the choir sang with then cantor Richard Tucker.
Mm.
And so we went to Brooklyn Jewish Center in the middle of nowhere, as far as I was concerned, Brooklyn. A Bronx boy doesn't go to Brooklyn. So anyway, we spent the high holidays at Brooklyn Jewish Center. There was a pool in the Brooklyn Jewish Center, and we were warned, don't go into the pool. But as a young kid, you don't really listen to adults. And so I went into the pool. And while swimming, I got a cramp and was yelling for help. Lo and behold, Richard Tucker was walking by and he pulled me out, and I would say, save my life, but you can draw your own conclusion. We developed an affinity for working together in a sense when I was in the choir. And sometimes I sang with him like a duet. He had a tremendous sense of humor. One time on a Sabbath service, Friday night to be exact, I'm going aside of what about me, but I wanted you to know about some of these wonderful people. He decided to change the tune of a song and do it to the tune of Sorrento. The end of the service is a little old lady comes up to him and the bima and asks him, can I ask you a question? And he said, surely. And she said, what? I know that tune that you sang, but I didn't, the words were very different. So he said, yes. And he explained to her what he had done. And he wanted to see if anybody in the audience really knew what the tune was. And he was very happy that she did. But that was Richard Tucker. The greatest part of being part of that group was when we had rehearsals in Lower Manhattan near Delancey Street. All of a sudden you would find his brother-in-law, Jan Pierce, would come into rehearsal, shortly followed by Robert Merrill. And then they would take a part of the Torah or the prayer that they wanted to sing, and they each had their own version. And we sat back and listened to the 3 greatest singers of Jewish music at that time really compete with each other and have fun with each other. And it was an experience that you never forget. Anyway, from Yeshiva Salanta, I went to Bronx High School of Science, although I had acceptance at Yeshiva University. And the rationale was very simple. Bronx High School of Science was a half a block from where I lived in the Bronx. So naturally, I went there, and it was a special school, and I did get a special education. From there, I went to NYU and took my master's degrees at Adelphi, and that's when I got involved in teaching. They had a special program for people who weren't in education or trained in education to be educators. And I joined that program, and then I started teaching. I spent a lot of years teaching. I went from teacher to grade advisor to assistant principal, to principal, to assistant to the community school, the head of the school district. So it was a long journey, a wonderful journey. I taught many subjects, everything but a language. And I learned about what kids are about and what life's about, teaching them and finding out why they stayed in school, why they didn't stay in school. And I made a lifelong friendship with a gentleman who came from a background that people don't realize. And Jim Wilson became an eternal friend. When I ran for Congress years ago, Jim Wilson was my representative to the Black and Hispanic community. He knew most of these people in New Jersey. And to this day, we are still friends. We see each other at least once or twice a year. And it's been a wonderful experience having Jim as not a mentor, but a real friend. And we talk about each other's families, etc. So education gave me a real broadening into a lot of different people, a lot of different backgrounds. And then one day, I think it was in the 70s, there was a big discussion on TV, radio, whatever. I don't remember exactly where, but the discussion was, who was a Jew? Mm. And I always thought, well, I was a Jew because of my father. Mm-hmm. And he was Jewish. I thought my mother was Jewish too, but they come from backgrounds of Judaism. But then I was told, no, it's because of the mother. I said, well, wait a minute. They both participate in the act to have a child. Mm-hmm. Since they both participate in the act, it should be either one or both. Mm-hmm. But one versus the other, to me, didn't make sense. Okay. So that was the point of my doing some real reading and analyzing what my religion was all about. What is Judaism? And I wrote the 3 books, Let There Be Light, Let There Be More Light, Let There Be Still More Light, talking about Judaism, but also about Christianity and Islam, and how they started, where they are, etc., etc. And I felt that was wonderful. Then all of a sudden, my brother Bob, who unfortunately is not with us, told me about ancient Hebrew. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, you got to understand that we once had a language that we don't have today. I said, and he said, why don't you research it? So I started to do that, and that changed my whole outlook. Mm. Ancient Hebrew, well, if you trace back the writing came from hieroglyphics to cuneiform, and we found that there were examples of cuneiform dating back to the Babylonian days, which is 400 or 500 BC, to ancient Hebrew, which evolved over many, many years and through different versions to the Hebrew we have today. So in finding out about the ancient Hebrew, as it came from cuneiform, each symbol had a meaning. So when you saw the cuneiform, you found out that there were different meanings to different things. And as I delved into that, my whole outlook changed as far as approaches to Judaism and to the Torah and to everything else involved. And so what I did was I went through the Torah and I found a lot of things I didn't like. Mm-hmm. As a teacher, I found out that there are truths and there are truths. For instance, example, 2 5s equal 10, and 5 2s equal 10. Mm. But with 2 5s, you can play a basketball game. With 5 2s, you can't. So sometimes there's a quality involved in numbers beside the quantity. Okay. If I took a pear and a peach, I have 2 fruit. But in doing that definition of fruit, I lose the identity of the pear and the peach. Mm. So we talk about quantities, but we don't talk about qualities. And I found that we talk in Judaism about stories and tales. We don't talk about the actualities and what words really mean and what was really said. So I went through the Torah and I picked out, and this is what one of my latest endeavors. I picked out some of the verses and some of the things that people should know about that are in the Torah that are not stressed, because we unfortunately have a habit of going to shul and every week we read a chapter from the Torah. First of all, there are no chapters in the scroll. If you look at the scroll, it has no periods, no ending of anything. It's a continuum. And the chapter idea was instigated by a Christian prelate in the 13th century, who decided that we have to break it up, which is why creation is in 2 chapters when it should be in 1.
Interesting.
And this goes for many, many things in the Torah. So this was one thing. And then I asked myself, why are there 5 books? It's 1 scroll. Who decided on the books? We can't find that out because there's no definite person that decided there are 5 books. Then I went to the fact that, well, 1 book contains the beginning. It talks about all the people before Noah. It talks about Noah. It talks about Abraham and Isaac and Israel, and that's another discussion we could have, and Joseph. And then it stops and goes into 4 books about Moses. And I said to myself, something's wrong. Why is Moses and the Exodus and what happened in Egypt 4 books? And what God said and who God chose and whatever reason God did that, why is that minimalized into 1 book? There's something wrong. So I went, as I said, I went to the scroll and I analyzed what the messages were. And there's about 50 great messages, one for almost every week, that rabbis could tell the people that are in the Torah. And it's not in chapter 1 or chapter 2. For instance, Cain killed Abel. Why? Of jealousy. Well, jealousy kills inwardly and outwardly. That's something that people should know as a way of recognizing what's important in life. To be jealous is a killing kind of thing.
So let me ask you, because obviously there's a lot of information just now, but I've read through your books and there seems to be a commonality of theme, and it's something that you are talking about in different segments, but there's this idea of questioning, the idea of whatever people in the Jewish tradition are taught, there's an importance to question the source and the question of what is the true meaning of it. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what inspired you to write the books in having this theme of questioning all these sorts of things. And then you mentioned also examples, and you were talking a little bit about Cain and Abel, but what's I suppose something that you would say in Jewish prayer practice that you think is something any sect of Judaism could be part of, that's something that should be looked at or questioned in your view?
Well, I'm going to question it for this reason. We are mired in Judaism in an era that existed a long, long time ago. We have a Torah today that was compiled way after the temple was demolished in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And it was done for a reason. This Torah we have today is not the Torah that Moses got on Sinai, if he got one. And I add that because if you read the Torah itself, it doesn't say that he got whatever he got at Sinai. It says something else, but that's irrelevant. But what is important is that It isn't the Torah. And if you study the history of Torah, we know that's not true. So when people get up in the temple, in the synagogue, and say, Zos HaTorah, that Moses said, that's not the Torah, people.
Mm.
We know there was a Greek version of the Torah that 70 wise men worked on for a long time in Alexandria, Egypt. And that was accepted by everybody because these 70 wise men were chosen by the Sanhedrin, the ruling group in Jewish law at the time. And yet we find that there was a group of Torah before that, which involved the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then there was another Torah, which involved people who lived in northern Israel at the time, who were called Samaritans. So there's a Samaritan Torah, and then there's the Torah of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then there's the Greek version of the Torah, the Big Torah. And I say the Big Torah because it includes things that our modern Torah doesn't have. And there were changes in each of these, and if you compare them, there are differences. So in line with that, I decided to go back in the beginning and see where things really came from. And my brother, as I said, inspired me to do this. He said, go back to the ancient Hebrew. See what it said. What did the cuneiform say? What did the letters stand for that they decided? And what did they even look like? And I did that. And I found out an amazing thing.
Okay.
That our interpretations are way out of whack. For instance, and I'm going to give you 3 of them because they're names of God.
Please.
The name Elohim, in reality, in old ancient Hebrew, means the provider of the blessing of life. Wow. That's such a wonderful statement that people made at the time. This was our God was the provider of the blessing of life. So I went further, and I went to Adonai. Adonai is the power that ensures the next generation. That's what God said. Seed, Abraham's seed will go to Isaac, Isaac's seed, etc. And we are all the way down the line. That's Adonai. That's a fantastic statement. Then I go to the last one, which is the book of Exodus, Ehiyah Asher Ehiyah. And we have it all wrong. It's not YH, it's AH. Ehiyah. Aleph is Ehiyah, not Yehiyah. So we copied it wrong from the text and we constantly make the error. But anyway, Ehiyah means behold the power. He told Moses, behold my power. I'm God. Behold the power. So those 3 definitions of what God's name really means is entirely different than whatever we have or is presented to the average Jew. So in doing this research, I found out, again, the short book that's going to come out, I hope, has to do with, the title is The Essence of the Old Testament. And that's taking about 50 things out and making them digestible so that people understand, what is this book really saying? Forget all who he said what and he said what and he was captured by what. What is this book, this scroll, this wonderful thing that's been passed on and changed and altered, whatever makes no difference? What are the basic messages that we should have? And so I've done that, which I'm very proud of. And the other part is, I've learned that there were scribes, and scribes copied words, but scribes also edited words, put in their own versions, took out what they didn't like. And so we have over 100 contradictions in the Torah. And you can just look at the first chapter and see God made light. Light, God called light day. All of a sudden, the Jews decided that day starts in the evening. Well, the evening, in reality, the word evening comes from the Babylonian and later the Greek. Didn't come before that. There was no such thing as evening. There was, think about the old days. There was day and there was night. There was no concept. So there's a lot of things that were added and changed, and that leads to problems. When you have 100 contradictions in a book that's supposedly given by God, you wonder, did God make those errors or did man? And I don't choose God to make errors. I choose man. The other part is we are created in the image of God. And the key word is not physical. It's not mental. In a sense, it's mental because the word is created. God created. It's called, according to Tom Paine, who's a little smarter than I am, the creator of all. God is the creator of all. Think about it. The whole universe, everything. The key to man's imitation is that we create. And we are creators just like God. And if you look in modern society, you know what we created. We created good things like the cell phone, like the computer. I created bad things like the H-bomb. But we create. And that's in the image of God because God's creations aren't perfect. No one ever said they were.
So let me ask you, because obviously there's a huge focus in your writing, and obviously as you're talking right now, about not just the origin, but the different meanings and how the changing of interpretations, obviously through time, can expand to reshape, Judaism or the text or the sermon or so forth in ways that may not have been the, intended, I suppose. And obviously we don't have to look too far back to see that Judaism from the original versus today is vastly different than anyone could have possibly imagined. I'm curious in your work and obviously your research and also what you're currently writing and did write, do you feel that the knowing, like going back to the original text, going back to all these things, that there is such a differentiation between that version of how they would see, how someone would see Judaism versus today, that is overwhelming, I guess is the way of putting it. In other words, if someone looked at the original, would they not recognize Judaism in a way that they could accept being part of, I suppose is a way of putting it.
No, because Judaism has changed over time, as it should. A religion should adapt to the times. Judaism changed from before Babylon to Babylon. The influence today is, as far as orthodoxy, conservative, even in some reform, is Babylonian Judaism. And it's not the same. The words don't mean the same. For instance, we constantly call the King of Kings, God's the King of Kings. Reality is there are no kings in power anymore. If you mention a king to a child, they don't know what kings are. They don't know what kings used to be. But so we're dealing in that word that has no meaning today. The prayers that we recite, people don't realize what you're saying. When you go to the Torah, you're saying the following, that blessed are the one who blessed. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. There is no such thing. We don't say thank you in Hebrew. Why not? What's this blessing bit? Mm-hmm. Who are you to bless God? Think about it. Well, the wise men knew they like these words, but they're meaningless. I want to say thank you, God. I don't see the word Todah Rabah, which is Hebrew. I don't see it anywhere. I don't see the fact that we yell about Judaism. We're not Judaism. We're Hebrews. Think about Am Ivri. Think about what the Torah says who we are. We are Hebrews. The Torah never talks about Jews. We are Hebrews. there's a big difference in our history as Hebrews and as Jews. The word Jew comes from Judea, which was split from the original Israel. And that leads to another problem. Why do we say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in our prayers when God changed his name to Israel? There's a big difference, if you really read the ancient Hebrew, between the word Jacob and the word Israel. And when you find that out, and I'm not telling you today, when you find that out, you know what I'm talking about. And the Torah goes back and forth. One paragraph is Israel, the other one is Jacob. One is Israel, the other one is Jacob. Well, who are we talking about? There's no confusion with Abraham and Abram. Once it was changed, it's Abraham. It's never Abram again. So why is this constant change of Jacob and Israel? And when you make a prayer, it's to Jacob? No, God changed it to Israel. So what are you saying? So do you really know what you're praying about and to whom you're praying? And what are the words? I was a cantor for several congregations at a time. I did High Holy Day prayers. And then I stopped and I said, what am I reading? And what am I saying? I'm reading maybe 60, 70% of the Psalms or quotations from the Torah. Well, I'm not praying. Praying is a communication between myself and God. And if I'm saying somebody else's words, that's not mine. Maimonides said it right. Prayer books are useless. It's your communication with God that counts. What you say to God, what God may reply to you. But God doesn't come back with words. There's situations you're put into that you have no idea about. That's what maybe God does.
So let me ask you, because obviously you'll want whoever's watching to read your books, of course, and learn more knowledge and information. But I'm curious if there's specific people, you mentioned Maimonides, other Jewish thinkers or theologians that you think people should know more about or should explore more, where these questions may come up in the interpretations and, you know, the original text and the original goal. Is there anyone who comes to mind for you that you think would help guide, besides, of course, your books itself?
My favorite guy is Abraham ibn Ezra, Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra. And why he's my favorite guy? Because he was diversified. If you want to go look at the moon and look at the craters of the moon and look at their names, one is named after him. Ibn Ezra is the name of a crater in the moon. And why would a Jewish rabbi be on the moon? Well, Abraham ibn Ezra was also great as far as everything was concerned with astrology and astronomy. But beyond that, he wrote beautiful poetry. Beyond that, he did the first Hebrew grammar. Beyond that, he wrote commentary on the Torah and on the Talmud and on Rashi and a lot of things. But the message I got from him was, I'd like to say more, but I can't. And so he alluded to certain things. And one of his great statements was, just because it's, well, Maimonides said this also, just because it's in a book doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah.
And just because somebody wrote it doesn't mean it was written by God. So these great rabbis alluded to many things. Some were too stringent because they had to be at the time. And you had to understand that if you said the wrong word at the wrong time, even though you had a belief, you'd be excommunicated like Spinoza was. Yeah. It's very funny. I read Spinoza and I read about his idea about God and nature, and God is in nature, but nature isn't God. And that was maybe one error he made. But I read that he was excommunicated, which he was at the time. And so I wrote a letter to the chief rabbi of Amsterdam about 10 years ago. And I said, how can I find out if the excommunication is over? And he wrote to me, he said, you know, you are one of two people in this life, my life, that ever wrote to me about the excommunication. And the answer is, once the person dies, it's over. I said, who was the other person? And he said, David Ben-Gurion. I felt very honored that I asked the same question David Ben Gurion asked, because Spinoza opened up the can of worms in a sense by questioning. And it's not his conclusions that were important. It's the fact that he asked a question. And those questions have been bothering Jews ever since. And there have been Jewish philosophers who've given their opinions about what God is and what God isn't. And we have whole branches of Judaism that thinks of God as made of this, that, and the other thing. Obviously, there are no proofs of anything. But the effect that God has is more important than what God is. And the effect that belief in God has on man is important. And there are many effects. Some people believe directly affects, and he's going to answer your question. Some people believe that it's up to you to find out the answer because God's given you this whole thing. If you analyze anything in this life that we've created, that's for the good of mankind, the basic source comes from the universe and what God made in this universe. So the creator of all created, and we constantly find out more things about what's created than ever before. We never knew about DNA. It's recent, but God had done this a long time ago. We're just finding out about how life can save life, how we can control certain things through our living. We are now able to live underwater. Never heard of such a thing. Man's ability to create was given by God. Our thoughts, our ideas come from a source, and you can name it anything you want. Eddie Albert and his wife Margot once made a fabulous record called One God. And in it they said, point blank, you can name God anything you want. And Jews name God with many names, and sort of many religions. But it's still the one God, people.
No, if I please. So I was just going to say, normally one of the questions I typically ask is, what do you want the takeaway to be from, obviously, whatever we're reading or discussing? I think you've kind of answered that question very well already. But for those who are interested in the book, or those who are interested in hearing you possibly speak, I know with the coronavirus, obviously no one's going into, JCCs or universities or anything right now, but where's the best place for people to either find your book or to be able to be in contact with you in case they want to learn more?
Well, if they want to learn more, the email is the best.
Okay.
And that's sshas@aol.com. That's the quickest way, and that's the way we can discuss things. I'm in touch with people who've been enlightened by ancient Hebrew and try to really find out what things really mean. I just want to read something to you. I don't know if you know this. Jeremiah in chapter 5, verse 21 to be exact, made this statement. Hear this, you foolish and senseless people, who have eyes but do not see, and who have ears but do not hear. And I have added the following: who have tongues that are tied and twisted, who have hands that are unclenched, and who have noses that are too nosy. So I thought sometimes we get some ideas from people who lived a long time ago, and we neglect their brilliance. And it's unfortunate. But as you go through these things, and you go through, as I am right now, the Torah, I find out that things are not sometimes what you think they are. And tales are not what they are supposed to mean if you really analyze them. And life itself has a meaning. We're here for a purpose. And if you analyze the three beginning people who started Judaism in reality, according to the rabbis, not according to me. See, I believe that there was a Jew way back called Enoch, who walks with God. If you walk with God, I think you're part of the group. I think you're Jewish or Hebrew or something if you walk with God. And God took him into heaven. So this must have been a fabulous person.
Hmm.
So, and if you go down the line, you go into Noah, and Noah made a pact with God. And God selected Noah to be the sole survivor. Why? And then when you go to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, you find that Abraham was a powerhouse,
Hmm.
a real powerhouse, in all sense of the word. Isaac was a lemach. He was a quiet guy who didn't achieve much. Jacob, not Jacob achieved really, but his sons achieved. His sons enabled certain things to happen that may never have happened because Jacob was a nice, quiet guy.
So
As you read, you learn lessons about people in life and what missions they fulfill. And you learn about peoples that existed at a period of time and don't exist anymore. You ask yourself why and how, and you find out. The amazing thing is somebody made a list. The number 40 is a tremendous number in Israel and in Hebrew. People talk about 7, talk about 13, which is another thing we should talk about. There is no bar mitzvah in the Torah. You become a man when you're close to 20. You're not when you're 13. The rabbinics did a good job on 13. They decided that that was bar mitzvah, but in reality, God never decided that because you're not a man physically and otherwise. God felt until you're about 19, 20. But hey, that's God, not me, and not the rabbis. There are a lot of things that present the problem to Jews. If you go to Genesis, you'll find out that God said you can eat everything. Black and white, flowers, plants, animals, any kind of animal. There were no restrictions. When you go to the book of Exodus and further on, oh, you can only eat this, you can only eat that. Yeah, there are words like clean and unclean in Genesis, but nobody ever defines them. They're just thrown in. So you get to say, well, does God want us to do this, or does God want us to change?
So let me ask, just because for timing, I want to make sure people know, you said how people can contact you through email. If people want a copy of your books, where would be the best place for people to find it?
Well, it's interesting. The old 3 books you can get on Amazon.
Okay.
Okay, Let There Be Light and those 3. The first one will give you an introduction into how I got involved in my background. Mm-hmm. The second one deals with Judaism, also with Christianity. The third one is mostly about Islam. Mm-hmm. And you'll be very enlightened. Everything is in black and white in all religions. There are good parts and there are bad parts. One of the interesting parts about Islam, if you really read it, is that suppose you or anyone came to me for a loan of money. And I said, okay, you're a nice person. I'm going to loan you money. And how are you going to pay it back? Well, can I give you a certain amount each week? I said, sure. So you give me a certain amount back each week. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the time, you've repaid the loan. But lo and behold, I took your money that you gave me each week and I put it in a bank account. And once you fulfilled your obligation and paid the whole loan, I give you the bank book and I give you the bank account. That's part of what Islam teaches. Very few people ever heard of that.
No.
That's one of the lessons. So in each religion, if you search hard enough, you'll find wonderful truths. The trouble is, just like in our own religion, we don't search hard enough. We read and we read, we read. As Jeremiah said, we see, but we don't see. We hear, we don't hear. The prayer, for instance, the Shema Yisrael is a joke. I heard it in Israel done by a Hungarian cantor the right way.
Hmm.
He said, Shema Yisrael, and he stopped and it was silent. And then on the top of his beautiful voice, he said the rest.
Hmm.
And that's how it should sound, not like the sing song we have in the temples and synagogues today. It's a disgrace in reality. In the same way, some of our prayers have to be changed. This is not the Torah of Moses. Let's be honest with our people. One of the things modern Judaism must confront is honesty. We have to start being honest on what people say and what people mean. And if you are honest, there's a joy in being truthful. And I start this latest book by talking about truth. There are only a few who seek the truth. There are fewer that tell the truth. There are still fewer that accept the truth. And that, unfortunately, befalls us in our religion. We are Hebrews. We're not Jews. Jews were given to us because of Judea. When Israel was split, there were Judea and Israel. And by the way, the Samaritan story has been blown way out of text. Samaria was the capital of ancient Israel when it was split into two parts. The Samaritans, unfortunately, were conquered by the Assyrians, and the Assyrians decided to chase them out and put other peoples in their place in Samaria. Well, some of the Samaritans were smart enough to go south. And what was south? Jerusalem. So they settled in what was Judea and Jerusalem. And they lived there peacefully until Ezra and Nehemiah returned with a whole group of people from Babylon to Jerusalem. And there the story gets twisted. And the rabbis make Ezra the big hero because he was the priest involved in the religion. But if you read the true story, and that's why I like the truth, without Nehemiah, Ezra could have done nothing. Why? Because Nehemiah was a confidant of the king. And as the confidant of the king, he had the king's ear. And so he spoke about the Jews, and wouldn't it be wonderful? And because of Nehemiah, his friend Ezra was allowed to go back to Jerusalem. If Nehemiah didn't exist, there would be no going back to anywhere. So the key to this rebirth of Judaism in Israel, in Jerusalem itself, was Nehemiah. Ezra was the tool of the religion, but the enabler was Nehemiah, and he deserves that high praise. Yes, Ezra deserves praise for what he did, but to forget Nehemiah's role is to negate the truth. And one of our problems in Judaism is we negate truths. We have to face them. Rabbis have to start facing truths. Rabbis don't make the law. The Bible does not say rabbis. It says something else, and the rabbis know this. There's no place in the Torah that gives rabbis any position. Rabbis assumed that position, and maybe rightfully, and they were needed after the temple went down. Rabbi Gamliel and his cohort saved Judaism. What do you want to call it? The right? We are Hebrews. We speak Hebrew. That's the language. The book's written in Hebrew, the scroll. It's not written in Jewish. It's written in Hebrew. So let's get this idea of Judaism. Anti-Semitism, that word was invented in the 1800s by a German, a guy named Marr, M-A-R-R. He decided it wasn't nice to say anti-Jew, so we'll say anti-Semite, even though Arabs are Semites. Duh. So let's get back to what it really is. There's no anti-Semitism, it's anti-Jew, and it's anti-Hebrew in reality. And let's say what it really is. Don't camouflage it. Let's get back to the truth. If you learned anything about the Torah, God appreciates truth. God doesn't appreciate stupidity, and God doesn't appreciate questioning what God decides. Moses found that out when he asked God's name.
So,
I told him, I will be who I will be.
Allow me, because you've certainly given us a lot of examples, a lot of information, and a number of the things that you mentioned are in the book. Some of it are not, so I'm sure many people who will go out and get the book will have a chance to kind of differentiate between the two. For those who are interested, as was said earlier, on Amazon, you can get all 3 of the books, and obviously the 4th one is being worked on right now. I just want to personally thank you to author Sheldon Haas for taking the time to speak with us today. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, and I think there's a great truth. Obviously, truth is very important, but in the idea of knowing the origins, the power of questioning, and finding that truth that works and makes sense for you in your life. So, I sincerely appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. To everyone who's watching, I hope you stay safe, stay healthy. Looking forward to having you watch more episodes. Author Sheldon Haas, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.